and my grandparents owned a trailer near Sacramento, New Mexico, in the Lincoln National Forest in the mid-90s, and my mother, two siblings, and I visited on a weekend sometime during that era. I had two teenage male cousins that were also visiting the same weekend. While there, my two cousins offered to take my mother, siblings, and I on a hike. We left shortly after sunrise, our first morning of the trip. The first couple of hours of the hike were normal enough, and nothing worth noting. However, as the day wore on, I remember my mother became worried that we were getting lost. She expressed her concern to my two cousins who were leading us. I remember them assuring us that they knew where we were, and we continued on. They wanted to take a different return route because they wanted to show us a river, which is a rare thing for folks from southern New Mexico. But as we kept going, there was no river in sight, and my mother became convinced that we were lost. My cousins assured us once again that we weren't lost and told us about a road a short distance away that we could wait at, while they went back to my grandparents' trailer to get a vehicle to give us a ride back. Once we reached the road, my cousins and my family split up. We literally waited for hours, without a single sign of my cousins, or any other sign of human life for that matter. And none of us was carrying a watch, and this was obviously before cell phones, so we were stranded. Eventually, a red SUV-type vehicle, I don't recall the make or model, came around the mountain. We were partially relieved, but also somewhat apprehensive, because we didn't recognize the vehicle. The vehicle slowed down when it came closer to us, without us having to flag it down. We didn't recognize the driver, but he rolled down the window and asked us if everything was okay. When my mother walked closer to the window to speak to him, she noticed a middle-aged woman in the front seat who she didn't recognize, and, to her surprise, my two cousins in the back seat. My mom ignored the man's question and immediately started asking my two cousins where they had been. She told them we were hungry and tired, and wanted to get back to my grandparents. Amidst her concern, they both ignored my mom. They just stared blankly ahead and remained silent. Initially, my mom thought they were joking, but the more she tried to get a word out of them, the more awkward the situation became. They remained completely silent and expressionless, staring straight ahead throughout the entire conversation. At this point, I remember my mother becoming visibly alarmed. The man and woman then asked us again if we needed help. They were both extremely friendly and never stopped smiling. My mother, visibly shaken, declined their offer for help and motioned all of us to return to the side of the road. As we walked away, the man said, "Be careful. It's easy to disappear out here," and sped off. Literally, moments later, we noticed my grandpa's van and take a corner going the opposite direction as the red SUV. Needless to say, we were immensely relieved. My grandpa stopped the vehicle right next to us, and we walked around to get in. When the door opened, we noticed that my two cousins were in the back seat. My mom then started shouting, a mixture of anger and amusement, exclaiming what a mean prank that was. My siblings and I joined in. However, my cousins said they had no idea what we were talking about. They said they had spent all day walking to the trailer, and as soon as they got there, hopped in the van with my grandpa to come and pick us up. My grandpa and cousins looked shocked at our accusations, and it eventually turned into a very serious discussion, with everyone recalling their exact actions, along with a timeline of events. Even after all these years, and my cousins swear they're telling the truth. I went to a summer camp when I was younger, and every summer at the camp, there was a 4-way long camping trip in the nearby national park. I decided to go on it, and our first day, we canoed for almost 7 hours into what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was a couple hours before dark when we decided to make camp, and we ported to a tiny bay and disembarked. One of the other kids in our group, there were about 10 of us campers and 4 counselors, immediately decided to head into the woods to collect some firewood, while the rest of us set up the site. Not 2 minutes later, he came sprinting back, shouting that he found a few people in the woods in huts and teepees. I remember laughing along with everyone else. He was sort of a goofy guy, so we thought he was full of shit. Until we noticed how serious he still was, so most of us decided to investigate. We slowly made our way through the dense forest. In less than 200 feet from the campsite was a clearing with people milling about. Set up in the clearing were actual teepees, along with a few huts made of branches. At the back of the clearing was a bunch of pickup trucks, and behind them was a dirt track leading away. And not 15 feet in front of us, as we emerged from the woods, was a huge table with probably 40 people sitting at it. They stopped and stared at us, and we stared back. Then this small, older woman with a feather in her hair stood up. She smiled and offered us some food. Our head trip counselor politely declined, then asked if it was okay if we were camping nearby. She said it wouldn't be a problem, and already the other people were getting back at their huge meal. She sat down and we turned and headed back to the shore of the lake. We were all pretty stunned that we were going to be staying the night a few steps away from a lot of random strangers in the woods. But the counselor said it would be fine and finished setting up the camp. We all turned in pretty early though. Now that I'm even older than those counselors were, I don't think I would have had the balls to stay there through the night. The next morning we got up really early and we were getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods. The old woman from the table stepped out and asked if any of us had seen her husband. Now, none of us knew who her husband was or what he looked like, and considering we had interacted with these people for less than a minute, it was pretty weird that she would come over and ask about him. Also, I swear this is total truth, she was holding a huge knife. I remember we were all very still, but one of the counselors said we hadn't seen him. She turned and left, and we hauled ass out of there. It wasn't until we got to the next lake that the counselor in my canoe relaxed and acknowledged and fucked up that had been. As if it wasn't enough, on the last night of the trip, I woke up in the pitch black middle of the night and stepped out of the tent. All 10 of us kids shared to go pee. When I was younger, I woke up to pee a lot, but it was the first time on this particular trip. As I started peeing, I heard rustling and noises, and then a short howl. We were camped on the side of a very narrow inlet and extended far back in the main lake, and in the darkness on the side of the inlet you could see glowing eyes. I have almost never been scared, but I bravely finished peeing and slowly, yes slowly, went back into my tent. I'm not religious at all, but that was one and only time that I felt legitimately prayed for those wolves that they didn't come over the water or around us. Sorry for the length of the story. November last year, me and my friend decided to drive up a car to Scotland to do some fishing and eventually make our way to Edinburgh. After the first day of catching some salmon and brown trout, we stored our catchers in the cooler box. After contemplating whether to sleep in the car tonight, as we had left quite late to set up camp, at around 4:30ish and the sun was going down, eventually I said, let's set up a fire and cook the fish. I didn't drive all the way to Scotland to sleep in the car. My friend agreed as we set off looking for a spot to camp. We found a little wooded area next to a car park near a farm. We looked into it prior, and apparently you can basically camp anywhere in Scotland, as long as you left the place as you found it. So, we grabbed all of our shit out of the car and started setting up our campsite. 20 minutes later we had a fire going, 2 fold-up chairs and 2 tents up. My tent was out of view from my friend. This will be relevant later. We were glad we chose to camp outside instead of sleeping in the car, as we smoked a few joints and we reminisced about school, life, and etc. My friend struggled to keep his eyes open as I checked my phone. 2 a.m. he called it, at night crawling into his tent and zipping it shut. I sat there with my feet up on my friend's now empty chair, listening to sounds of the wildlife. I shut off the torch and had hung up on the tree next to us, leaving it in the darkness, apart from the burning embers from the coal. It must have been 3 or so minutes before I started to hear the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs that seemed to be coming toward me. Being a quite rational person, I passed it off as a fox drawn to the scraps of food we might have laying around. I was quickly proven wrong when I heard a sniffle, like someone with a cold clearing their nose. My high quickly turned from chilled out to paranoia as I feel a heavy dread come over me. My mind raced. Why the fuck would someone be here in the woods at 2 to 3 a.m.? Why are they coming towards me? I slowly reached down the pocket and felt my heart drop as I didn't feel the smooth blade of my pocket knife. Shit, must have left it in a tent. All the while I hear the treading coming closer and closer and my heartbeat racing. Had the darkness I see a middle-aged man, clean shaven, parted hair, around 5'10", slowly creeping toward me, almost in all fours like a predator, trying to stay out of sight. I sat there paralyzed, unable to speak. My mouth was so dry that I could hardly swallow. That's when I realized he hadn't even seen me. Being under the tree with no light source, I must have blended in. Also, with there only being one tent in view, I guess he thought my friend was the only one camping here. He got closer to the tent and half breathed and half whispered, "Come on, do it," in a raspy voice. Creeped the fuck out and unable to bear the thought of what he might do next. "Oi, can I help you?" He jumped up at shock, and his whole demeanor changed. He looked to be mumbling awkward as he scurried back out of the woods. I sat there, still trying to comprehend what had just happened and what I saw. Then I saw headlights of a car turn on and drive away. I woke my friend up, and he could not tell what had happened, but he could see how shook up I was. Without full explanation from me, he willingly grabbed all our gear and we slept in the car that night with the doors locked. I was on a field trip to our local park. Our teacher decided to let us go on one of the trails. This trail had a larger trail and a smaller trail inside a slough. The smaller trail had a slimy, stinky pond inside of it. The small trail was a circular area surrounding the pond, but the pond had an area that went under a little bridge walkway. On the side of the bridge was the pond, on the other was a flowing tiny creek. My friend and I decided just to take a small trail and to stop at the bridge and wait and then go back to the bus, because we didn't feel like walking that day. So that is what we did. I remember it being shaded by the trees except for the little bridge, so my friend laid down on the bridge in the only sunny spot, facing the larger trail. You could see the smaller trail from the larger trail, and I thought I saw a crawdad. I love those things and decided I was going to go into the little creek and grab it. I remember thinking that it was convenient that there were stone steps down into the creek. I walked down and just didn't think anything of it. I remember standing in the creek and looking down. I remember saying to my friend along the line of something doesn't look right in this creek. Look at it. It just seems to go on for a long time. But it shouldn't. I mean, it should end at the parking lot. The parking lot was in front of the trail right outside the tree line. I remember nothing else. Nothing. At some point, my shoe was untied and I stooped down to tie it, and my stomach growled. I said to my friend, "We need to go back." I stepped at the rocks and out of the creek onto the bridge. My friend agreed, and I remembered being kind of afraid. It was like spooky here. It seemed so late, so let's hurry and go. She agreed and got up and ran towards the entrance. Our teacher, our classmates, and our buses were gone. But the cops, the firemen, and the principal, and our parents were all there. They were getting ready to drag the pond. We had been gone for 4 hours. Numerous people walked both trails and walked over that little bridge, they said. They were mad because they said we could not have been where we said we were. They were mad because they thought we were hiding and not coming out when they screamed our names. But we weren't lying. My friends and I became distant, though. We've never talked about it again. Not even once. I love creepy stuff and spent a lot of time listening to stories on YouTube and reading them in various places. A friend of mine came to me because she knows I love stuff like this and told me she had a strange experience the other night with her boyfriend when she was parked near some woods on the edge of town. And just as they were about to start fooling around, something made a creepy, giggling noise from the woods. Her boyfriend got out and threw some stones into the woods, thinking someone was playing a prank or something. She said he shined his phone light into the woods, and they both saw what looked like tiny people scattering back into the woods. I asked how tiny, and she said about the size of a dog, which is a little white fluffy thing. I'm not sure what type it is, but they are really small dogs. I drove up to the woods that night to check it out and parked near where she had said she parked, but didn't hear anything. So after a while, I got out of the car and went to the woods to look around. I didn't want to go too far, as I swear I had took less than 20 steps into the woods when I heard a laugh. It sounded like a little girl, but I'm not really sure how to explain it. It was kind of off. I spun around and pointed my torch where I'd come from, and there was nothing there. Then, as I was looking around for what had made the sound, I realized I was really far into the woods, like seriously far into them, as I couldn't even see my car or even the road. I know I hadn't walked this far. I was confused as hell, and when I had to head back that way, I wasn't even on a path. I was freaking out because now I'm lost in the woods. I calmed down and weirdly didn't panic after that though. I remember being what I could call drunk calm, like when someone kicks off a problem at a bar, but you've had a few, so you just got no reaction to it. Like part of you knows you should be reacting, but you're just not. I just looked around and started walking in what I felt like was the right direction. But the more I walked, the more that I felt like I was dazed. And I kept thinking that it was not because it was so hot, but maybe something else. It was pretty late at night, so it shouldn't have been hot, but I felt like I was on a beach on a holiday somewhere, and I just kept thinking I needed to cool down to clear my head, and I started stripping. I'm seriously not the kind of girl who just strips off, by the way. Like, I'm not shy, but I don't do stuff like that. My head was just so fuzzy, and I was convinced I'd feel better if I took everything off. I was just dropping everything as I walked, even dropped my torch, as I just felt like my eyes would see better without it. I don't fully remember what was going on after that, but I felt like I was walking for ages, like everything just felt like a dream. But I felt comfortable, even though I was naked. Though, I still felt like it was really warm. I don't know where I was, but I remember finding a small pond and trying to cool off by splashing the water over my head, and then sitting at the edge dangling my feet in the water. It felt deep, but like I was on the edge of a pool, like it was just straight going down, though it looked like it had little more of a large puddle. I remember it being really nice and cold when I felt my hand and ankle run through the water. Then a second, it was just warm again. I could feel hands around my ankles, and I started laughing as something started tickling my feet. I'm not sure how long this went on for, but in my memory, it feels like it was happening for hours, just giggling and thinking about getting all the way into the water. I'm not sure what broke me from my daze, but I felt like someone else was there, who said something to me. I remember pulling my feet out of the water, and the hands letting go without a fight, and turning back into my car, and very suddenly being uncomfortable about being naked and starting to panic. I seriously half considered going back into the woods to find my clothes, but thankfully decided against it as I imagined the few awkward moments getting home were better than risking the woods again. I have no idea what to think about what happened, and I'm pretty sure no one is going to believe me, but I had to tell somebody about this. I mean, has anybody experienced something like this before? Just getting lost in the woods and then all of a sudden finding your way out. Three years ago, in late spring, I was hiking on Lava Lake Trail. I was hiking with my then girlfriend and our three dogs. They were all 50-pound plus dogs. The hike was going well, and we had hiked about 3 miles up the trail, a couple creek crossings on the way as well. When we reached around the 3-mile mark, we stopped for a short breather. Where we stopped on the trail, off to the right of the trail was about an 8-foot tall berm that my husky ran on the top of to chill on while we had a short breather. It was about a minute max. I went to reference that I also had a Garmin GPS collar for him. Once we were ready to go, we only had 2 dogs. Panic set in, and I was calling and whistling for him as I'm checking my GPS to where he did be. I thought he had started chasing a deer or whatever caught his interest. The first odd anomaly was the tracking trail my GPS to his collar left. It was not flowing with how a dog would run. They were straight lines which went up in very steep hills and then straight down, ending at the creek crossing, at about 1/4 mile or so at the start of the trail. As I'm running down the trail, calling for him and pressing the tone beep on the GPS, which he knows that he needs to come back to me, his tracking collar is not moving from the creek, and I finally start to hear him whimper and barking as I'm getting closer. I could see the creek, but not him. Once I was about 100 feet from the creek, I finally spotted him. I only saw his tail, but I could tell he was struggling to get away, like when you're playing tug-of-war with a rope, but holding his collar. His front half was hiding behind the creek embankment. Once I was finally 10 feet from him, it was like he was released. He ran up to me, scared and shaking. My curiosity of what could have been stopping him from coming to me got the best of me because there were no branches or roots that could have snagged his collar. The amount of force trying to pull him away and his demeanor when he was reunited with me. My feelings around that creek made the hair on the back of my neck stand. Why did the other two dogs not follow if he was chasing something? His tracks on the GPS being straight lines and not zigzags as a dog would run is very strange. About 2 years ago, on a summer day, my dad and I went for a quick hike on the hills that overlook our city. On the hills, there are many reservoirs, many of which are surrounded by the woods of fir trees and are places of great beauty and quiet usually. The particular reservoir we were hiking to provided us wonderful views of the city and we knew the route well. However, since we had been hiking in the late afternoon, we only had an hour or so before dusk set in. We decided to walk fast. We trekked up the pebble path from the bump gate that loops around the reservoir. You can't actually see the water until you've scaled a small mound in front first. Well, Dad and I were nearing the mound, heading towards the water, when things got really strange. This man, probably in his 20s, was running barefooted and shirtless along the mound from one side to the other, back and forth, over and over again. Huh, I thought, that's odd. Yes, it was summer, but where I live, summer is not a guarantee of warmth. So even though it was August, there was still a sharp chill in the air. Plus, we were quite a few feet up to the rush of winds and have made it too cold to run half naked like this. Maybe he was doing it all for a thrill, or maybe he was hammered. We didn't stay long enough to find out. As we approached the water, a good distance from the odd runner, we could see the remnants of a fire ahead of some fir trees. Then ashes, sands were littered in strips of burnt foil and realized there must have been some drug use here. We thought that might explain our runner friend over there. The man was utterly oblivious to us, so we passed by and he seemed harmless enough. But when we were behind the woods, climbing over the rocky pathway, we saw another man stumbling and blinking like a drunk. His clothes were filthy. His general appearance was unkempt. He looked rough and he'd probably been sleeping that way too. Perhaps he'd even been camping on the hills. I was a little uncertain, to be honest. This man stank of alcohol, seemed to be doused in stuff, and he was grumbling to himself as he lumbered by. I worried that he was drunk enough to give us a hassle. Perhaps he even followed us about. He looked at me oddly, in a way that made me extremely uncomfortable, and I just wanted him to get away from me. Thankfully, he passed us slowly without any issue. I started to breathe normally again, but I was still on high alert. When we came around the reservoir through another bump gate, we noticed that the runner was gone. Didn't understand this as I'd only seen him 5 minutes ago or so I looked around and tried to spot the man himself or his clothes, as I was curious about him. He'd been acting really weird, like he was completely out of it. So I was peering through trees, trying to peek over the reservoir mound. I even looked behind me, up onto the hill, in case he had snuck by us and was coming up and I didn't see him. We were passing through the gap between some trees and I was looking into the woods to see if I could find the runner between the firs, but then I saw something and stopped. And not just something, but someone. Someone sitting amongst the trees with dark eyes and face. Eyes that glared at me. What the hell? I was close enough to see that the lurker was a man. His clothes were baggy and his hair was long. I couldn't see his face too well, but I could see his mouth open and I stared closely. It was like he was snarling at me, like a vicious animal. I was thinking to myself, what the fuck is he doing in the trees? He was crouching about 50 feet from us, quiet and alone. It occurred to me that he may have been the runner, but I soon realized that it couldn't have been the runner, because the runner returned, jogging along a mound about a minute later. The drunk we had passed had gone in another direction and I hadn't seen anybody else up there, so it was really creepy to just see this person sitting there, lurking amongst the trees. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen the creeper in the woods and continue walking. My heart rate was accelerating and my head gathered a cool sweat. The thought of him just watching us made me shiver. At least, my dad was with me. Walking back seemed to take an age and my nerves made it difficult to move. I was tempted to look back round, but I didn't want him to know that I'd seen him in case he'd panicked and took action. It was getting pretty dark now and Mr. Lurker about twice as scary, so I wanted to get away from them all. All the weirdos, even the seemingly harmless ones. Back in the car, I told my dad about the man in the trees. He hadn't seen them. I don't know if my dad truly believed me. Perhaps he felt like I was exaggerating and the supposed malicious intent on the creep's face. But I swear he was scowling and snarling slightly at me. It was freaky. I'd never gone to this part of the hills late again due to this experience. It is truly a beautiful spot and I love going there, but I guess you could say it's pretty dodgy around dusk. When I was, my best guess, about 8 years old, I was visiting my cousin at their house across the neighborhood. Being a group of bored children, we decided to bring my cousin's neighbor, Jaden, on a hike through the massive woods behind their house. We set off, stepping over poison ivy, and making our way over to an abandoned paintball place in the middle of the woods. We explored the nooks and crannies of the place, eventually wandering into the hills and streams of the Michigan wilderness. We were having fun, having hiked almost a full mile where we began. An odd thing to note before I continue is that the entire ground was completely covered in garbage. I mean, you could barely take a step without stepping in an old plastic bag or discarded tin of instant potatoes or something like that. We joked that maybe there was a neighborhood back there at one point, but now, it just seems sort of obvious that this was some kind of old drug hangout or a place where hobos lived, but we never thought much of it. Being a humid summer night, the air hung thick with the smell of water, leaves, and mud. We ventured on, finding places where the ivy grew a pale color, seeming to reflect the gray sky. The hills were brutal and tricky to climb. At some point, we got turned around and found ourselves at the entrance of some old, out-of-use ATV trail or something like that. We warily stepped onto the trail, hoping to find a neighbor's house, or the street we lived on, but we had no such luck. We were lost miles from home. I was put off by how the trees grew together to form an intimidating archway over our path. The four of us locked eyes as we heard a familiar sound. Breathing. It came from a bend in the path, and was now obscured by the now twilight sky. All of a sudden, we heard hulking footsteps crunching the pre-autumn leaves. They were coming straight for us. People say they freeze in fear, but that's bullshit. That theory went 0 to 4 out of our group. We immediately booked it out of the trail, onto the main path we hiked on, and sprinted mostly blind through the woods until we saw light at the top of an ominous hill, the hill behind their house. We scrambled up the hill, dirtying ourselves and getting cut up on the bushes and brambles. We booked it inside, and were too tired to explain to our parents, so we just huddled in the TV room and basked in the air-conditioned glory of safety. In early April of 1978, members of my extended family took a trip to the Sequoia National Forest near the confluence of the Kern River and Brush Creek Flats. The party consisted of my grandparents, parents, uncle and aunt, cousins, and my siblings. I was about 8 when this happened. In any case, about noon, One afternoon, my aunt laid my cousin, age almost 3, down in a tent for a nap. Our grandparents were in a trailer just above the tent, and the camping spot was hemmed in and by the river and creek on the other sides. To reach the creek, you could take a small path over the side of a steep embankment, and the river was a similarly steep trail. It was a warm day. My cousins and siblings and I were eager to go back down to the creek, and my parents went down to watch us. To be fair, I don't know why my aunt thought it was okay to leave a toddler in a tent alone, but my grandparents were in line of sight and never left their camper area. They looked in on Katie around 1, and she was still asleep. Around 2, my aunt realized that Katie had been asleep for 2 hours and wanted to wake her so she could go sleep at bedtime. So she went up the hill. 5 minutes later, all hell broke loose. My aunt reached the tent to find Katie not in her sleeping bag in the tent. She assumed she was with our grandparents in the trailer and went up to look in on her. My grandfather was sitting outside and my aunt said, "Hey, is Katie inside with Mom?" My grandfather said no, she's sleeping in the tent. Of course, that sent my aunt into a panic because Katie wasn't in the tent. Everyone started looking for Katie. I remember very specifically my uncle running to the pit toilets because she feared that Katie tried using them by herself and fell in. My parents were scared Katie tried looking for us and maybe toddled over to somewhere else and maybe drowned in the river. Either way, no one was anticipating a great outcome. Us kids were asked to walk up to the creek to the easiest spot to go down the hill to see if she was anywhere in the creek bed. She wasn't. After checking everywhere with walking distance, my cousin flagged down a passing logging truck with a radio to call on to the authorities, where my other uncle drove down to the little store to make a call to the police. Meanwhile, everyone who was an adult, save my grandfather and grandmother, who was left with us in the trailer, fanned out to look. The logging trucker radioed up to their crew base, which was near Johnsondale, and asked everyone to be on the lookout for a child. They were upriver and had trucks coming down almost every half hour. No one saw Katie. There was no real sign that she had been anywhere. When she was laid down to sleep, my aunt had left her in shorts and a tank top and a white leather sandals with a buckle. And now, she was just seemingly gone, lost in the woods, and vanished. By the time anyone official arrived, it was 4 p.m. and hot, like 100 degrees plus hot. I can't remember the exact sequence of events of the afternoon, but at one point, the assumption was Katie had likely went down to the creek and fell in and was pushed into the main current. Some fishermen had been cutting their way downstream and hadn't seen anything, and no one in the campground downriver saw anything, and the river got shallow in some places, shallow enough to hang up on rocks and branches, but it was just like she just disappeared. One thing everyone noted was that Katie was not the sort of kid to walk off by the road by herself. She also hated the noises that the brakes on big trucks made, and we all pretty were confident that she wouldn't have left camp. It just wasn't in her nature. We have expected to find her playing with her sand toys in the dirt somewhere under a tree. Around 9, a dog handler arrived and they used the scent of her blanket to track her, but the scent just stopped dead by the river. Oddly, the scent didn't follow above Bush Creek's inlets. That just about killed my aunt. So at this point, it was just the assumption that she was in the water. It was a complete feeling of hopelessness. They decided to see about getting a search and rescue team, specifically one trained in swift water, but those just weren't around back then. But it was just decided that the crew they had would start heading up the canyon for over another county and see what they could find. About 5 o'clock in the morning, a crew arrived and they started to formulate a game plan. Meanwhile, some forestry guys were walking the road looking for any sign, and they found a sandal above, where the dog indicated said she was in the river. Above, about 20 feet above. Just off the side of the road. Odd. That refocused the search. Maybe the dog tracked an earlier trail, or maybe it had just been wrong, we thought. About a mile upriver, there's a really, really tall bridge. A fisherman had taken a game trail down there and wound it up on the outside of the river. He saw a small white tank top in tatters. It was covered in those little wheat-looking brambles and torn. It was so beat to shit that he didn't even pick it up. But on his way back to his vehicle at around 8 a.m., he was stopped by a game warden and questioned, as many people were. He told the warden he'd found a tank top and then went back to retrieve it. It was near the bridge, and it was Katie's. Simultaneously, a hiker recalled hearing what he took for giggling in a child's voice hours later in the dark near the bridge. All of these men had solid alibis for the night before. Just at about the same time the radio crackled, and to everyone's astonishment, my cousin was found, like 5 miles up the road, across a very slippery creek, just above a huge waterfall. She was totally nude. A car coming down from another campground saw her just standing there in a daze. She wasn't upset, just dazed. Not cold, not sunburns, not hurt in any way. Her feet and legs were a little scratched up, but the bottoms of her feet were perfect. To this day, I have no earthly idea how she survived what she is alleged to have survived. A toddler, allegedly cut through the brush, crossed a river, gained about 2,000 feet of elevation, and walked 5 miles in blistering sun. She survived all night outside with no clothes on, no blisters on her feet from walking on hot granite. She didn't stumble or fall. The easiest assumption that everyone is quick to make was that she was abducted. But by whom and how? And deposited where she was found just doesn't make any sense. Why were her tank top and sandals found where they were in the condition they were? It makes no sense. Where were the rest of her clothes? They were real for days stated as dehydration and exposure. But when they were asking her what happened, she didn't talk about being taken or held against her will. She talked about following a bear man. None of it adds up, and to this day, it's a family mystery. From 2012 to 2013, I did a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range in Oregon. I frequently would go out by myself for days and come into town to restock on food if necessary. It was commonplace from when I was in town to spend the whole day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took wasn't well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything else. I had chosen my campsite for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity, avoiding conventional locations. I had only a cell phone on me during the period of hiking and camping, no bright clothing, and no GPS tracking device or emergency beacon. Probably wasn't the smartest idea looking back. There were times I heard and saw things while out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight or sound. But nothing came close to the incident I had in May 2013. I had done my usual restock in a small town, some 6 miles from where I decided to camp for the night, and I spent the day in town as usual. I started walking back to my camp location about dusk. Half of the walk, I chose to use dirt roads, until veering off from the deer trail that I used earlier in the day. By this time, it was completely dark, but it was clear out. Impossible to see the trail still using the moonlight. I don't listen to headphones while hiking. I have always felt it wise to be able to hear what's around me, in the event there's a predator, whether human, animal, or whatever. I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike when my mind literally stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything, and I don't make hardly any sound while hiking. If I had heard something, I would have known. For some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure. I was jolted quite suddenly out of the thought, and very aware of the fact that I wasn't alone on this trail. What was odd to me, especially, is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, no light wind or birds, I knew acutely that something was behind me, specifically about 30 yards down the trail. I still to this day have so many unanswered questions about how I knew this. Standing really still, I turn around and look down the trail. I don't see anything, but I feel it. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I felt, because I hadn't felt that way before or since. It was straight up fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying there's nothing out of the ordinary, while my senses were saying, get the hell out of there. Again, looking back and remembering this, I have no idea what to say. This is really hard to write. It was like I was being taunted and I felt it. The presence of someone or something was down that trail, and for some reason, I knew that, it knew that, I knew it was there, even though I couldn't see it. That's what still scares me to this day. It knew, and it was bright enough out for me to see down the trail 30 yards back, no problem. There wasn't anything on that trail, and I'll swear by it. It was like I was being taunted or beckoned to come closer. This was maybe 30 seconds into looking down the trail, if that. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think because I wasn't seeing anything threatening. So I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I didn't know what else to do. I knew that if it was, in fact, a guy out to kill someone, he's probably going to end up killing me on this trail or in my tent after following me back to it. So why run was my logical thought. I would say it wasn't even a minute into my quick trek back. Then I hear what I can only describe as a sound like rushing or swooping air, followed by what seemed like a ray sliding across the dirt trail, the former sound happening right after the latter. These sounds happened together and half a second apart for 4 times, and they were very close to me, maybe 20 yards back. Looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed and not soil myself, but somehow I mentally stayed focused on getting back to my tent, ignored the panic, and just kept walking quickly, not looking back. Whoever or whatever it was still followed me the majority of the next hour. I just kept heading forward and didn't look back. A few minutes from my camp location, the fight or flight feeling gradually left, and I crawled into my tent, but I didn't sleep a minute that entire night.